when Boris's government is finally analysed by historians, they will conclude that it all went wrong when his wife Marina walked out on him because of his affair with Carrie. And that if Marina had been in Downing Street, none of this would have happened. She was his anchor, and she was a terrific guide to him on reasonableness and seriousness. And Carrie is the opposite.
Well,
I think it's always odd, if you don't mind me saying so, Camilla, that feminists always seem to suggest that women are not responsible for their own behavior. I mean, Carrie has taken various decisions. She has interfered. She has destabilized the government with various initiatives and arguments, which we can go into. And she must bear responsibility for her own behavior.
Hang on, Tom. She's responsible for her own behavior. In what way is she responsible for Boris Johnson's behavior?
She isn't responsible for his behavior.
But that's what Lord Ashcroft is saying.
Well, yes, but what she has done is she has interfered in a way which has made him take decisions which he shouldn't have done. Now, there's no doubt it's all his responsibility. But you've got to bear in mind one thing about Boris Johnson. He is a man who's a loner. He has really no male friends at all. He's always in his life relied on his wife and on his mistress. And in Carrie, he has joined the two, and it hasn't worked. Now, you can say...
Well, hang on. How are you saying it hasn't worked? Because there's a great deal of pushback on this from Downing Street, as you can imagine, saying that they have a, quote, very emotionally supportive relationship. This is in response, by the way, to claims of Ashcroft that Mr. Johnson had been telling aides, don't do anything that's going to make her torture me when I get home. You've just got to help me. My life at home's miserable. You've got to find a way to make this bearable for me. Now, we've heard this kind of rhetoric from Dominic Cummings, who quite unkindly nicknamed Carrie Johnson Princess Nut Nut. These are huge smears against a relationship which, frankly, no one really knows. Nobody really knows unless they're inside Downing Street observing these two at close quarters.
Well, exactly. That's the contradiction that you just made, Camilla. Nobody really knows unless they're inside. And insiders do tell us that it's a terrible relationship for several reasons. First of all, she demanded that he be a modern father. So the Prime Minister literally had to have Wilfred in bed with him, screaming as a baby, and getting up in the middle of the night to change nappies. Now, that's
do we know
impossible.
This? How do we know this?
Yes, we do.
Tom?
Well, we know it from sources.
You're claiming it. I can't verify it. You're claiming that.
Fair enough.
Right.
Well, it's an allegation verified by people who are there.
Well, it's not an allegation, is it? To have a newborn in your bed. I mean, most parents... Newsflash, it's 2022.
Yeah, but he's the Prime Minister. He can't get up in the morning and be exhausted. I mean, there are exceptions when you're in that job, and she didn't want to make those exceptions. Secondly, the whole redecoration of Downing Street. You can just imagine Boris. The Prime Minister makes 40 decisions every day. She says, I can't live with Theresa May's John Lewis thing. He said, well, redecorate it. So she goes to the most expensive interior designer in London, who orders for her bar stools, £8,000 each, Chinese hand-painted wallpaper, a bill of £200,000 for a man who's got no money whatsoever. Now, this is completely irresponsible.
Well, perhaps they thought that donors might pay for it, which they ended up doing, didn't they?
It was inexcusable. It was reckless. It was inexcusable by a grown woman to think her husband, who's got no money, can afford £200,000. And I must say, the argument with Dominic Cummings about Allegra Stratton, which sealed Dominic Cummings' fate, was just madness. I mean, the girliness between Carrie and Allegra Stratton and forcing Dominic Cummings out was just reckless and was, in my view, an example of a woman who's a political clot. She thinks she knows about politics, Carrie Johnson, she doesn't.
Okay.
And it has led, in my view, from a disappointment about Boris's performance to disgust, because in the end, what was Carrie Johnson doing holding a surprise birthday party in the cabinet room? I mean, that had nothing to do with Boris. That was Carrie Johnson's decision.
All right, so hang on a minute. You seem to have segued. You've segued from him taking responsibility for his own actions to her taking responsibility for his actions. And also, what about her defence to this? Let's listen to this a minute, Tom. Ashcroft contacts her to say that he's writing this book, and we can just imagine the kind of people he has spoken to, who we know are openly critical of Carrie Johnson, Dominic Cummings, probably even Sir Linton Crosby, Boris Johnson's former campaign manager, who we know didn't get on with her either, both men, I don't need to point out perhaps. And she replied saying, "I do not consider myself to be a public figure and try to be as private as I possibly can." I mean, she's got a point, hasn't she? No, we've barely seen her. She's been lesser spotted. She's been lesser spotted in Downing Street.
She keeps on posing photographs and posting photographs of herself on Instagram.
Okay.
She's not a private figure. And the other thing which you say it's only men, well, Munira Mirza, who resigned this week, had terrible arguments with Carrie Johnson in her interference. It's just not accurate, that. It's women who complained as well because she tried to interfere, and she did. I mean, the environmental agenda. And Boris undoubtedly is an environmentalist, but this has gone too far, especially the animals from Kabul. This was clearly Carrie interfering. And we know that she called Simon Case. We know she called officials in Downing Street and told them what she wanted. So, it's Boris's fault because he brought her in. Entirely his fault, and his fault for not telling her to stop it. But she must take responsibility for what she did.
On the environmental front, isn't he also hugely influenced by his father, Stanley? Why does nobody ever point that out?
Well, they do, and of course
Not
in my
as
book
much.
I did. Well, no, because at the moment the focus is, ever since my book pointed out what an abusive abusive husband Stanley Johnson was, his stock has fallen. But I think when you go back to it, as I wrote in the Spectator piece 3 weeks ago, Boris Johnson came from a very unhappy, broken, poor family. He was not a rich toff and very happy, and there's no doubt his unhappiness and his instability and his chaos comes from witnessing the terrible relationship with his father and mother. And that has driven him, in a way, to both succeed, but also to have terrible flaws. And those flaws have, sadly, disappointed his supporters because he had so much going 2 years ago, 80 majority and all the rest, and it's all fallen apart. And that has as much to do with his appalling childhood as with the character which then followed, as with his relationship with successive women, both his wives and his mistresses. Okay. And he is just, unfortunately, got himself into a position where he can't save himself anymore. It's too late.